everyone, welcome to the Art Workshop. My name is Christopher Epling. We really appreciate you tuning in today. We have a very special short show in store for you. We're going to be looking again at inks. It's just a very cool medium. I really like it a lot. It's probably my preferred medium to work in. And what we're going to be doing is a landscape scene, going in now to springtime, exiting fall. Kind of fits a little bit the setting, I think, what we're going to be working on. We're going to be looking at depth also in a drawing. So what is depth? How does depth interact with the different elements that you put on your paper or page or canvas? We're going to look at that as well. So thanks for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the show. We'll look now at a little bit of our materials. That's always my favorite things to talk about. So for materials, we're going to be looking at pencils. We're going to be looking at some erasers. We're going to, of course, variation on ink pens. Now, ink pens, of course, there's no standard ink pen. When we talk about ink pen, it could be ballpoint, it could be felt, it could be something like the Pediograph or the Koh-i-Noor, which are more technical pens. Sometimes they have reservoirs you can fill. Sometimes as soon as the ink runs out, you're done. You have to toss it away and get a new one. So when we say ink pen, has sort of a loaded term really. And like with anything with art, one tool can have 1,000 different uses. So when you think ink pen's one use is just to make lines, well, you can do a few different variations on things with paper using ink, and we'll talk about those today. So if you want to follow along at home, and we hope you do, please do, we'll go over the materials, but if you were to follow along and you want to share what you create, you can do that really easy. Just take an image of it and send it over to us at piketv99@gmail.com. Include your name, maybe where you live, or even your age if you want to. If you're a student, you can include whatever information you want, where you go to school if you want. It's up to you, but we want to see your work. We'd love to share what you create. Even if it's not something, though, that you've done following one of these tutorials. If you did something on your own you're just really proud of, we really want to see it, okay? So I'm working on watercolor paper today. Watercolor paper is a thicker paper. Of course, it's meant to be able to hold water. So it's not going to really have a lot of breakup where the fibers start to erode as you're working on it. So if you were to use a wet medium such as watercolor or even heavy paints, even acrylic or ink even, if you don't use the right paper, what will happen is eventually those fibers will break up and you'll have problems. Now you do need an eraser, you need a pencil of course, you don't need a block eraser. This is just what I'm using. The pencil I'm using is just a standard sketching pencil. It's a 4B, which means it's a little darker than probably what I would use if I was doing this at home or something, but for you to be able to see it, of course, on the camera, we need it to be a little bit darker. Now here's where we get into those loaded terms about technical pens or ballpoint pens or felt pens, so on. What I'm using today is felt pens. Now I don't endorse any type of brand at all. We don't here on the show, but just so you're referencing this is a Tombow. They sell these in any even like large store that has even a slightest art supply section. You'll find these. They're really relatively cheap and I love them. The reason I love them so much is usually they come in a 2-pack like this, and you have one tip that's going to be hard and one soft. So that just means that the felt that is used to hold in the ink is one's a little bit more durable than the other. But you get a variation of lines with these pens, so you can go from thin to thick and then from thick to thin. So they're really cool. Now this is a Pediograph pen. This is a technical pen. This is more used, really was invented to be used at least with more architectural type drawings or drawings that use the need precise lines. A lot of cartoonists will use these though because of that precise line. So you get the same width of line consistently no matter what. Ballpoint pens are used for inking. I don't have one here with me, but you can. Now this is a fountain pen. Just to show you, this is more of a nib tip. Now the difference is with this than a standard nib holder is nib holders you have to continually dip that into a reservoir and then use it, but with this one you have a reservoir built in that you can go and once this runs out, put another reservoir of ink in and you're good to go again. Some ink pens can be a little costly. You do not need an expensive pen to follow along. Just something that you can make lines on paper and you should be good. So we're going to start off with this drawing by establishing at least one of our horizon lines. We're going to actually use not really 2 horizon lines, but we're going to be playing around though with depth with this, and I'll show you more what I mean as we go. So we're going to start about midway on your page and just create a line going across your paper like this. It doesn't have to be a perfect line, just something that can establish, okay, this is the upper part and the lower part, okay? So now we're going to start bringing elements into it a little bit. And the first thing we're going to do is come down into this quarter portion of your paper. And I want you to take your pencil and you're going to bring a line coming in. This isn't a straight line. It has a little bit of curves to it here and there. It's going to come around. And what's going to happen is it's going to go down towards the lower left and stop, okay? So now you have this line being created, okay? Now, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create a little element right here. So this is almost like a little island, okay? Right here. Now this island is going to have some foliage on it, and we're also going to have some rocks in the background. But we're going to fill up this space with trees. And the trees are going to be going, of course, upwards, but we don't want it straight. So we're going to start off with a batch about right here. So take your pencil and make a line coming up. Make it a little bit crooked. This isn't going to be real straight, okay? Towards the top. Again here. There we go. So that's one tree. Now notice where I placed this. It's in between these lines that I first started out with, right? But we're going to do another one now, this time going off to the left a little bit with the bend up to the top, as far as you can go. Do the same thing, almost like a parallel line. It's not really necessarily parallel. Eventually it will touch, but we want to just fill this space up. As you go up, further you go, bring it closer in to that first line. Now we have one more tree we're going to create. So sort of like a batch of trees. So this is birch trees, and usually birch trees they grow in pairs or more than two sometimes. So we have one more. Now this time look what I did. I started off sort of in the middle there, in between these two, but I brought the line starting up here where these lines are already been established, okay? So now we have 3 trees growing, and we want a few more. We're going to come down to about right here, a little bit lower, a little bit closer to you. Now we talk about this a lot too in the art workshop. You have your background and your foreground in a drawing. And your background is exactly what it sounds like. It's everything that's going to take place far off in the composition of your page, okay, or canvas. So what's furthest away from you would be your background. Your foreground is the exact opposite. So we're working to build up our middle foreground, which is about middle portion of your page, with some of these elements. We need to fill it up, okay? So we want a few more trees here. So do the same thing you have been doing. Now this little birch growing here beside itself is an exception. It doesn't have another tree growing beside of it. This one will. But look what I'm going to do. I'm going to start up on this line here, come up, and then up in this direction too, okay? Now behind these elements, which would be in between this line here, you have these things that are happening, right? We want to have more to the composition. So we're going to start back, further away from us this time. Now look, this is going to be smaller. It's going to be closer together. It's going to come closer together a little bit faster than the other lines did, making up the other trees. See that? So this tree is setting sort of, let's say, in between whatever's back here and whatever's here, okay? It's in between that. And we're going to put a couple more. This one, a little further away. Now we can start to see the top of this tree. Now look how thin those lines are. We don't even try to leave much room for them to come together. They almost automatically just start being pulled together because of how much we can see of this tree, okay? Maybe a couple back here. Now these will be further away. This way off in the distance. So we're going to see the tops of this tree. And see how thin I made this one. All the way up. And all I'm doing is just bringing these little lines out from the lines I start on. I'm trying to make each one of them a little different. So every single limb could be unique, and they usually are, right? When you think of nature. So there's patterns in nature, but usually they're not the same types of patterns that are made by people. There's certainly patterns. Now we have a few things going on now. We have this element here, which is in our foreground. Our background's been established with the vanishing horizon line, and then we have trees popping up throughout. What we want to do is focus here on this little tiny island for a second. Now we're going to be drawing rocks, and when I draw a rock, all this is you're going to be drawing what looks like an oval, but when you get to the bottom, so that's the top of this oval, when you get to the bottom, then we're going to round this out a little bit smoother than the top, okay? Because that's what's setting in the water. The top, you'll see all the variations of the shapes of the rocks, but when you get down to where the rock touches the water, it's smooth. The water is up against it. So there's a couple rocks here, and then we'll have one here. Again, the bottom should be smooth. Maybe a couple more peeking up behind it. Maybe one setting here off to itself. Something like that, okay? Now let's focus on that background. The background isn't finished yet. The background needs a little bit of help. And what we're going to do for the background is something super simple, but it can overcomplicate it by thinking too much. So we don't want to do that. All we're going to do is start on the left-hand side. We're going to go across our entire page, and we're going to be making these lines that come up, okay? It looks like, almost like if you were drawing grass. We're not drawing grass, but almost like if you were. I'm just making hash marks. Now look, as I'm making these hash marks, I'm following my horizon line. So where I start drawing is the same on every one I make, which is the horizon line. Now I'm going up only so far. Notice that? I don't have a lot of, it's not a roller coaster when it comes to the tips of these little hash marks. We're not going up and down, up and down. Now some are, but for the most part, you know, the idea is if you were to take a ruler and lay it down, you would notice that the tips of all these little hash marks you're making would end relatively around the same width, okay, like that, all the way across. And what we just did is not draw grass, but we established this row of trees in the background. So that means, though, that the tops of these are going to have all these little lines kind of poking up, forming the tips of the trees. Now you can do that. Now you go back over it, start on the left-hand side. You're going to go across the entire page now, forming tips of trees, okay? So the idea is that there's a forest, or at least the edge of a forest, setting off in the distance. And what we're doing is standing by this little lake in the woods. Maybe it's early spring, and we're looking off into the distance at all the different things we can see. Now hopefully your eye at home with what you're drawing can see on your page how there's depth here. So there's definitely an order to how things are drawn. You have these here, which appear larger to us, the mid portion, and then the back portion, right? Now, before we start inking anything, what I want to do is put a little bit more detail in the water, okay, and around the base of the trees. The more information you can give yourself in the penciling stage, the better you will be when you start to ink or paint. By information, what I mean is, what all can you include in pencil that you will need to cover or address later on? Instead of trying to later on say, well, I want ripples in the water, but I don't know, where should I place them? And using a brush or a pen to do that, you might make mistakes. So it's just good to prepare. Now, a part of preparing, of course, the erasing. So when you drew these lines forming the tree, you still had that giant horizon line going across. So what I'm doing now is just erasing in between them. I'm erasing also inside the rocks here. So we won't have any lines cutting our rocks in half. One back here. There we go. Now, usually what I would do is have some sort of a brush to brush off this, because your oils of your hand, when it comes to working with pencil, I've smeared it a lot, especially when you use a heavy, dark lead like I'm using. Now, look at the lake again. We're going to start here, and we're going to draw these ripples kind of coming out and back in. See that? You're going to go out, back in. Each time I do this, I'm making the distance between each ripple a little bit further. See that? Distance between the rock and the first ripple. It's pretty close. This is about the same, a little bit more, and this is, of course, extending that distance as you go. Now, a few around these rocks too, maybe. One a little bit closer here. Then again, as you start moving out, now these ripples will actually connect with one another there. Around this rock. So instead of a lake, this could be like a small creek or something, right? Around the base of each tree, we want to also include some grass, okay? So look what I'm doing. I'm just making the same type of line that you did earlier when you formed the edge of the forest back here, but this time it is grass. And in this time also, you don't have to make each one the same length. You can play around. Now we're going to use shadow in this piece a lot. Shadow helps establish depth too. We talked a lot before in different types of tutorials that we've done here on PAC TV about using your light source to determine where your shadow will be. If you want to resource some of those older episodes, you can find those on PAC TV's YouTube channel by going to PAC TV 99, search for that, you'll pull up the channel. Once you do, click on playlist, and when you go to playlist, you're going to see the Art Workshop as being one of the fine programs here, one of the many fine programs that PAC TV offered. And I'm not saying this is a fine program, but I sure hope it is. But compared to the other ones, I mean, you know, I hope we're doing pretty good. We're trying to hold our own. But anyway, you get on there, you can pull up some past episodes. And in those past episodes, you're going to find tons and tons and tons of information on shadow and light source. Okay? Now, while I've been jabbering, I've also been drawing, as you can see. I added some grass around the rocks. Now, these are birch trees. Birch trees are those trees that look almost like they have tiger stripes on them. So all I'm doing now is just putting a few lines here and there going up the trees. And all that is just where the bark is starting to fold on itself. So the birch trees are kind of like snakes. They shed their skin, if you will, ever so often and create new bark. And as they create new bark, you find that they have these little, real pretty designs of the bark. Sometimes there are a whole lot of them. Sometimes there's only a few of them. All right, I'm going to go all the way up here. And I'm going to put a few more over here on this side. Now, we will be adding a few limbs sticking out with ink. We're not going to draw those in. And we'll cover that here just in a little bit. But just put you a few lines going up and down the tree, various places. So you should have everything set up now with what you'll need to ink at this point, okay? We may add a couple more trees way off in the distance as well when we start inking, but we'll see. All right, now the next step in this is actually laying down some ink. Now I'm going to start off using a felt tip pen, and I'm going to start over here, and I'm going to trace over the lines that I've just got through drawing. That's all I'm doing now at this point. You're tracing over your own work, okay? Now, also, during this phase of the drawing, you want to be sure and only ink over the things that you want to keep, because once you get through, you erase. Let's say you've drawn over something that you didn't mean to be included in the final version of your drawing, then you're going to be, a little disappointed because there that thing is. The only way to get rid of it at that point would be to use whiteout or Pro White or something like that. Now I just switched pens because that one, its tip was has been put through the ringer, so hopefully this one will hold up a little bit faster. It looks like it might. Now we're going to talk about line variation too. So what I mean by line variation is exactly what it sounds like. You're going to have thin lines for things that are further away from you. The things that are closer to you will have thicker lines to them. And that all goes in playing on what the eye perceives as depth. Okay, so these trees way off in the distance will be a little bit thinner in terms of the width of the line, okay? So keep that in mind as you're going. So if we're following that rule though, and we're going to, that means that the rocks in the front should have a very thick line to them, and that's what we're going to try to pull off here. Now there's one type of pen I did not talk about that I will here shortly, is an option for inking, and it's a brush pen. Now a brush pen, there's different types of those, and like I said at the beginning, when it comes to art supplies, you'll find that there's 1,000 different variations on one tool. But the brush pen typically is exactly what it sounds like. It's a pen with a brush tip to it. And brush pens can either be disposable, just like the felt, or you can buy those that you can keep adding ink to and reusing. And there's also variations, just like with paint brushes, on the types of tips that you have with those brush pens. Some are sable, other are things like mink hair, or I think not mink, but I don't really, horsehair even, I've seen, like the, like taking the mane of a horse even. I've seen some brushes use that for the material. But you'll either find real hair, I'll put it that way, or you'll find ones that are synthetic. The synthetic ones hold up pretty good, but believe it or not, the real hair that you'll find on some brushes will hold up much longer, as long as you clean it and keep it nice and usable. You can go on forever with those. Now, the breakdown starts happening though with these brush pens if you don't use them. So if you have a brush pen sort of laying around and you hardly ever use it, it's been months since you've done it, it will dry up. And when that happens, you have a few different options. You can either take it and soak it in water for a day, overnight. Typically that will loosen up whatever dried ink in there. Now if it's been setting for a very long time, helpful tip for that is to get some Windex. And you get a cup, put a little bit of Windex in the bottom of that cup, fill it with water, then just put the pen down in it and let it set with the tip in the solution, and that should break up whatever's there for sure. It may take a little bit longer, but it'll work. I'm just finishing up on this last tree out here in the distance. So you can see a lot of those limbs sticking out on the top, so it takes a little bit longer. And you can notice now, even with those limbs, I'm starting to barely press down with my pen. See that? Okay, now we're going to work on the elements here in the foreground. With that, I'm using that brush pen, which is right here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start on this rock, and this will be very thick lines. The watercolor paper is not liking that brush pen too much. Let's jump over and use a little bit water version of this felt pen and see if that helps. There we go, that's it. You can see how thick I'm making these lines here now, right? This rock's a little further away, so this one's very close to us. I'll go ahead and draw how the water sort of comes up to the rocks too. Like that, rounding off the bottom. Now, as you're doing this, you've given yourself a lot of information to go from, but as you're actually inking, you're continually adding to your composition, okay? And this is where this happens. So we have a line establishing the side of this creek or lake, but we don't want to just trace this line exactly how it appears. What we're going to do is go around this line. Use the line as your baseline to work from. Just like you drew the trees on the horizon line earlier, you're going to draw these little shapes in ink coming off, going all around. So this is the grass that's beside of this body of water, okay? So you can see now, you can draw some sort of sticking up between the rocks here, some even all the way down to the edge of the water. So now I'm going all the way around the page, drawing these little hash marks, following the line that I drew for myself and creating that line for the water, okay? Inking is one of the most relaxing things you can do, I think, if you're into art. It just eases your mind. You sort of meditate on this one action you're doing over and over, which is putting ink down, and it's just so relaxing. That's why also coloring books, adult coloring books, if you've ever seen those, that's why those exist. Can truly calm you down and put you in a zen set of mind, I guess. Not too zen, you'll fall asleep and make a huge mistake on your page, but it's relaxing. All right, we got a few ripples here. Now, let's continue on with what we're doing with the grass by working on the base of these trees. We're not putting too much shadow in yet. All we're doing is just trying to get all the elements sketched in. Base of the trees. There we go. Notice how each one of these looks a little different too. Each time I'm drawing these blades of grass sticking up, I'm trying to put a little bit of variation in how they kind of flow up from the bottom, right? So you're wanting to make it look as though that it's very organic. Now we're going to work on the trees themselves by going and coloring in those little hash marks that you made earlier. It's going back and forth up the tree. As you get towards the tips or top of the tree, you probably see less and less of the really big, thick breaks of the bark. You're probably looking more a little thin kind of lines towards the top up here. We'll go up this one, doing the same thing. Notice how I place some on the left-hand side of the tree, some on the right, some right up the middle. Variation's important, you know, when it comes to this, because if you're trying to make something look organic and you're drawing a scene from nature, typically there are really no straight lines in nature. There's not a lot of really precise shapes, geometric shapes. There's not. And when you find one like that, that's why a lot of archaeologists, when they look for things or evidence of past civilizations that's been covered up through time, they look for very precise geometric type shapes. So if they do like like a scan using LiDAR or something from a plane, like over the Amazon, it can see through the canopy of the trees down to the ground, and if it sees something that's a straight line, they say, okay, that's something worth looking into. So as you're working with your composition and you're starting to fill up these forms into shapes and whatnot, you want to be sure and make it look organic. So you want to just sort of, you know, not try to be too precise is what I'm trying to say. Which is always fun when you're drawing, because being precise, I think, is miserable when you're drawing. But sometimes you have to. Alright, so one more tree and we just about have it. The last thing we're going to do is we're going to fill up that background with a little bit of some ink too. And then, once we've done that, we should have everything sort of filled out composition-wise. And the last thing then left to do is to go back over it and add shadow. And that's the fun part. I keep saying each part's the fun part, but as you can tell, I really like to ink stuff. But when you start adding shadow, things sort of come to life a little bit. Okay, now the main back portion of this, we want to see at the main bottom here, where everything starts, your horizon line, thicker lines, okay? The idea for that is that there's a lot of trees in this forest. Trees typically grow in a fashion where they're thick at the base of the trunk. It goes out to the canopy, spreads out, and becomes thinner. If you have thicker lines at the bottom making up your horizon line, then go back over it again, just as we did earlier, making the little squiggly lines sort of pop out from it. It will give the effect that, you know, this forest edge is filled inside of it with a bunch of trees. See that? So all along the bottom, it's much thicker. Now, you probably have a lot of variation on the types of trees in this forest too, but we're pretending that this is either late fall, early spring, so you're not going to see a whole lot of foliage, and that helps us tremendously, because if we were to do that, we'd be here a while. But now what I'm doing is starting down at the base where I just went across and made all those little hash marks, and I'm pulling lines up from it, forming the tips of the trees. You may have to put a few lines here or there across just to kind of fill up that space where these two things meet. And the two things that I'm talking about, of course, is this line of hash marks and then what you're drawing now, which is the tops of the trees. So where those two elements meet should be a little darker. You may have to fill it in. You may have to go in and put a few lines here or there. But you'll notice where you need to put it after you draw all this out, okay? Sometimes it's best just to go all the way across and maybe even purposely leave out where they connect and do it later. All right, we're going across the page all the way to the edge. Variation in line here, going from thick to thin as I go out towards the tips of the trees. And you can get that with a felt pen very easy by how much pressure you put down. So you notice when you go to buy pens too, you'll have a different sizes of your tips, right? You'll have a 0.5 or you know, let's say a, you know, a 0.25, and all that just means is that, you know, what size of tip do you have on that pen. And with a felt option, you know, usually there are sizes, but they usually come in different shapes too, like a wedge or a brush or, you know, a fine tip. But if you find one that is a fine tip, and you can usually push down on it and get a variation on the thickness of that line. You can do that with wedge tips too, but I always seem to navigate towards the fine tip marker because I just have more control over what's going to be coming out of it that way. You notice I'm going back across here now, just putting a few more little lines where needed, just to fill up that space. There we go. All right, we have the lines going across now. We've established everything. Let's put a little bit of shadow. Now what we'll do, we'll start out here. First we got to determine where's our light source, okay? So let's use the eraser for the sun. The sun is up here. All the light is coming in this direction. That means everything on the left-hand side of all these elements will have shadow. Starting off with this tree in the back. Now how do you show shadow? Well, I can either draw a solid line coming out, or you can go in and make these tiny hash marks forming what might be grass or whatever's growing, and come out like this with it. See how that works? So you start to pull a shadow out. And all I'm doing is just basically making little tiny hash marks here and there. You want to have more hash marks the closer you get towards the base of the tree. So the closer you get to the tree, you're going to have more little lines, okay? Something like that. And we're going to do the same thing now with these here. Now here we have very, very large lines, right? It's closer. So we're going to see these blades of grass are going to be larger. So I'm going to come out with it towards the left, doing the same thing that I've done all along, the same thing we've done, just making those little hash marks here and there. Now the real exciting part is we're going to get to the water. When you show anything reflecting on water, it's always a tricky business, but we'll try to see if we can't get through it. Try being the optimal word there, but we should be okay. The one great thing about art is that there's a million ways to do one thing, like I said, and the real point of it all is just having fun, you know, just seeing what you can make. Not trying to impress anyone, not trying to win an award. You're just wanting to have fun making marks on paper. If it comes out looking really cool at the end, awesome. You'll probably never think it will. If you do it, that's just one of the sort of the banes of being someone who likes to draw or make art, is that every time you make something, you'll look at it and be like, wow, I could have done that better. But other people may look at it and just be like, that's incredible. How did you do that? But we don't do it for other people. We do it for us. We do it to have fun. Now, let's go ahead and put some more blades of grass right here going out towards the same sort of flow of lines that we started out with over here. That's why this shape that we created first is so important for the base of that tree, because how we applied lines from this first tree will govern how all these other trees sort of distribute their shadow. So their shadow is going to be distributed in a similar type of not pattern, but orientation, right? So this is sort of down to the left. This should all be sort of down to the left. You could really throw off a drawing by, let's say, placing the shadow of one of these other elements going off into the other, off into the different part of the page. The viewer is going to look at that and be like, well, someone may have a flashlight standing over there by the edge of the lake, or maybe that, you know, some wonky solar stuff's going on with the sun, who knows, but there we go. Now I may just add a few more different little hash marks here and there just to kind of reinforce that there is something growing out here. And now with these little hash marks, they'll of course be sort of back and forth following that horizon line. These aren't going to be positioned anyway. This isn't really necessarily shadow. It's just variations in the depth of the ground, maybe, that, you know, it's causing a little bit of shadow to form here and there, but nothing too much. There we go. Now we're going to focus on the water and the rocks. So we have this little island growing off here, and for that what we'll do is we're going to add a few more blades of grass sort of coming off up from it, okay? And these particular blades of grass are going to be thick, and we're going to just try to fill up this space, okay? You'll see what I mean. Something like that, okay? Large enough that we can tell it's closer to us. Now, let's focus on the rocks. So the rocks, here's their sun, right? So the rocks are going to have the same sort of flow as the trees. The shadow will appear on the left-hand side all around here, okay? And what I'm doing now is just making hash marks where the shadow will be. Okay, do the same thing here. Shadow will come all the way around there. And then this one here. All right, great. Now we're also going to focus on the water. Here's where things get a little fun. So what we're going to do is go around the edge of our little creek here, and we're going to go back and forth with our felt tip pen, okay? What we're going to do is we're going to form the edge of where the water meets the soil, okay? And what we're going to do is, as we're going back and forth, we're going to pull the line out towards us and make it sort of thinner as it goes out to the main tip, okay? So all we're trying to do is go back and forth as we come out, a little bit thinner, less lines, that sort of thing, okay? As you get towards around this edge, we may just put a few less lines as we did over here. It's further away from us, number one, and number two, there's nothing here except grass on the shoreline. A little bit of shadow here beside this rock. There we go. Now the ripples. So the ripples aren't necessarily casting a shadow, but there is going to be some stuff happening with light here, okay? How light reflects on water can be super tricky, especially when you're working in pen. So what I'm doing is starting out here on the edges of these ripples closer to me. And I'm starting out by drawing a thick line back and forth, and as I go towards the middle, I'm lessening the pressure and I'm making less lines. Thinner lines, less pressure. Same thing here. Less lines, okay? And what I'll do probably for this one is just put a couple lines here, not much. Do the same thing over here. Really thick. As it goes out towards the middle, thinner. Thick. And thinner, okay? Same thing over here. Back and forth with your pen. All we're trying to do is establish that this water is flowing and there's things being reflected, light is being reflected. Now, one of the last things we're going to do is the trees are casting a shadow, but there's also going to be a reflection in the water. And for that, what we need is to show portions of this tree here. Now, we have a little bit of a problem though, right? If this water was very, very calm, the reflection would be straightforward like a mirror, but where the water is flowing, the reflection is going to be skewed at certain points. And we'll start over here at the base. Now, you have to kind of use your imagination at this point, right? Because how will this tree look if you sort of just picked it up off the page and laid it back towards you? Well, you'd probably see a line coming out this way. And then you'd see another line sort of following that line here. And you don't have to be super, super detailed with this. You can sort of just, sort of be impressionistic about it, or a little bit of, have fun with how you put it in there. It doesn't have to be precise. Now I only have a few lines sort of sticking out here. It doesn't look like much yet, but when I start adding a little bit more detail, such as maybe the bark, there's a few lines here and there coming off from where the bark would be, then it starts to fill up a little bit easier then, right? Okay, great. Now, after you finish with your inking process and you feel you've gotten to where you need to be, oh yeah, there's one more thing to do. I'm so sorry. I just had a few more lines kind of coming off these trees here like this. I mentioned doing that earlier, but there we go. You could also continue to add some trees off in the distance if you wanted. But for time purposes here, we're gonna have to quit here pretty soon, okay? But you could continually add trees as long as you just make them, I guess, further out away from where you started, but you'd have to probably use Pro Out. So never mind, you can't add trees. You have to, once you start inking, you're locked in. See, I told you. All right, last thing to do after you've done all this is get your eraser. That's why I use a block eraser. If you do large pieces and you want to erase all those pencil lines, you'll eat up the end of a pencil pretty fast. Now hopefully all the ink is dried. Typically when it comes to felt tip pens, they dry pretty fast, especially on watercolor paper like this. There's always those exceptions. And if you don't give your piece time enough to dry, then you're going to smear your ink, and that's one of the absolute most discouraging things to do after you've worked on something for a very long time. It can be fixed, of course, but it just stinks, you know. You see, you've spent all this time on this drawing, and then you go and you start to erase those lines, and everything starts to pop out at you, and it looks really, really neat to see the ink sort of just standing there by itself with no pencil lines under it, and then bam, you hit one area that's just not dried all the way, and then all of a sudden you've got the swamp thing standing in your nature scene, sort of, but it can stink. So far, so good here, though. But we're not done yet. We're getting ready to go into this very, very, very heavily inked portion. We'll see what happens. Now, you always miss an area when you erase, so you'll erase and sort of rub all those eraser pieces off, and you'll see, oh yeah, I missed this completely. So let's do that now. All right, there's a couple areas, but hopefully you've enjoyed today's program. I really think inking is something that everyone can do, and you can pull off a lot of effects with inking too. You don't necessarily need, need a lot of different pens. You can use one pen and a variation of line, and you're good to go. But always remember to sign your work, put your name on it so everybody knows who completed it. And if you followed along today, please, please, please send it in to us. We'd love to see how you did. And even if it's not this particular scene, that's okay. You can send us whatever you've got. We'd love to share it, okay? All right, so thanks so much for tuning in. We appreciate you, and we really hope that you've enjoyed today's tutorial. I don't know, I love inking. I could keep going on this all day, but I won't have to quit, I guess. But thanks again for tuning in. Hope everybody's doing well. And as always, on behalf of Pike TV, I'm Christopher Epling for the Art Workshop. Until next time, keep drawing.